As I discussed in a previous video, when it comes to removing the rich from power, the problem is not apathy, which means not caring. The problem is hopelessness. Most people know we live in essentially a dictatorship of the rich, a fake democracy, and they care about that very much. They don't like it at all. They would love to remove the rich from power, but they feel hopeless about being able to do that. And that hopelessness is the reason that we see very little of a mass movement that aims explicitly to remove the rich from power. Well, what are the sources of this hopelessness? I think one of the most obvious explanations is what I call the proverbial 82nd Airborne Division, meaning that the rich obviously have an extremely powerful military force, not to mention the police force. And it's obvious that the military force that the rich have with their U.S. military branches can overpower any civilian militia with the rifles that people are claiming are important to own from the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms and so forth. I have an article I'm going to post about guns in the working class in which I support the Second Amendment, but we need to address the fact that rifles are no match for tanks. So, does the proverbial 82nd Airborne Division mean that hopelessness is well-founded and that people are perfectly right to feel hopeless? Well, the answer is no. And, you probably are not in a mood to hear me, an egalitarian revolutionary, tell you why the answer is no, because, hey, of course I'm trying to persuade you of that, and I'll use any cockamamie argument, that I can come up with. So let me refer you instead to a book that was written by Crane Brinton in 1965 called The Anatomy of Revolution. I'm looking down at my little notes here. So who was Crane Brinton? Well, he was a professor of history at Harvard University. And during World War II, from 1942 to 1945, he was special assistant to the Office of Strategic Services in the European Theater of Operations. So he's an establishment guy. But the establishment needs intellectuals to keep them connected to reality. So he wrote a book called The Anatomy of Revolution, which could be interpreted as a book to the establishment, warning them about, hey, if you're not careful, there could be a revolution. This is what you got to be on the lookout for. So now I'd like to read to you one paragraph from this professor's book. He writes on page 88, Petrograd in 1917 is the most perfect example of this important role of the military and the police. Everyone, from Tsarist to Trotskyite, admits that what turned somewhat chaotic and aimless street demonstrations into a revolution was the failure of the elaborate government plan to restore order in Petrograd in case of uprisings. And that plan failed because at the critical moment, the soldiers refused to march against the people, but regiment by regiment came over instead to join them. Again, such is the advantage which a disciplined force with modern military possesses over even the most inspired civilian revolutionaries, there can be little doubt that if the Cossacks and a few of the famous regiments of the line, the Preobrazhensky, for instance, had been warmly loyal to the government, even the somewhat incompetent rulers of Petrograd could probably have put down the disturbance. We may, however, note parenthetically that the nowadays common view that modern weapons have for the future made street risings impossible is probably wrong. Modern weapons have to be used by police or soldiers who may still be subverted, even in the atomic age, end quote. And of course, the event that the professor is describing in 1917 was the event which led to the Tsar abdicating. So the Tsar and the aristocracy he represented lost power. I'm going to include some links to articles at the bottom of this video that will give you a detailed account of what the professor was referring to when he said regiment by regiment they refused to carry out orders. It's quite an amazing episode in history. The main point about this for us is the following. If we build a large enough and determined enough massive popular movement for the goal of egalitarian revolution, for removing the rich from power, to have real, not fake democracy with no rich and no poor, then that movement will be able to win over a critical mass of members of the military forces to refuse orders to attack it, and even to go over to the side of the movement and use their weapons to help defend it against those who would attack it violently. But until there is such a movement, so large and determined to remove the rich from power, not just to win some reform, soldiers are not going to go over to the side of the movement and refuse orders to attack it. And why not? It's not because the soldiers wouldn't be sympathetic to the movement. You know, the people who enlisted in the American military forces did not do it for the purpose of keeping the rich in power. They had a number of reasons, which varied maybe from person to person, but keeping the rich in power was not one of the reasons. And the soldiers would be as inspired and supportive of the idea of removing the rich from power to have real, not fake democracy with no rich and no poor as their families and their neighbors and their friends, as the general population would be. Now, the reason that they would nonetheless carry out orders to attack that movement, even to kill people in it, is because they're under discipline. And by that, I mean that the soldiers know that if they refuse to carry out orders, they would be severely disciplined and possibly even executed for treason. So if they refuse orders to attack a movement and the movement fails to remove the rich from power, the soldiers are going to be in deep trouble, and they know it. And that's why there isn't going to be a critical mass of soldiers refusing orders to attack the movement unless the movement is sufficiently large and determined enough with the explicit aim not just of winning a reform like the huge demonstrations going on in Hong Kong now, but to remove the rich from power. Because only on those circumstances would soldiers have decent reason to believe that by going over to a movement whose goal they support, that they would end up being on the winning side and not executed as a traitor. So in order to remove the rich from power, to make this scenario unfold, what do we have to do? Well, the first thing is we have to know that it's a possible scenario. And then, based on knowing that, we have to start doing the work of building that enormous, powerful, explicitly egalitarian revolutionary movement. I'm hoping to counter the hopelessness by helping people to see that we can remove the rich from power. So please look at the articles I've attached below. And by the way, I live in Boston, Massachusetts. If you live near there and want to help me build the egalitarian revolutionary movement in the Boston area, as I am working to do in my neighborhood of Allston Brighton, please get in touch. My email address is included at the bottom of this YouTube. Thank you.